There is a smell to a dead world that nobody warns you about. It is not rot. Rot belongs to a planet that is still trying. What I am talking about is the smell that comes after rot has finished its work, when the rain has washed the last of the marrow out of the soil and what is left is a sweet, mineral nothing. I have walked through that smell for 4 years. I expected to die in it. My name is Hendrik, and before the sky burned, I was a horticulturist attached to a forward medical company. That is a long set of words for a man who knew which leaves would close a wound and which roots would put a soldier to sleep. My grandmother taught me. She had hands like cracked leather and a voice that never lifted, and she said that everything green was a kind of patience. I believed her then and I believe her now, though most of what is green these days is not what she would have recognized. She lived alone in a stone house on a slope above a goat pasture, my grandmother, and she taught me by handing me things. Here is comfrey, she would say, and put a leaf in my hand. Here is wormwood. Here is mallow. Here is what closes a cut, and here is what slows a fever, and here is what you give a man when there is nothing else to be done, and you cannot bear to watch him go awake. She taught me in the order a thing might be needed, not in the order of any book. The book learning came later in the army, and the book learning was thinner. Her hands knew things her mouth could not say. I have thought about her hands a great deal in the 4 years since. I have looked down at my own hands and seen hers underneath, and I have understood that a man does not become his grandmother, but a grandmother can become her grandson if the grandson is willing to let her. The strikes came from orbit. We had 3 minutes of warning, and most of those minutes were used by men trying to call their wives. I remember our captain standing in the bay with his helmet under his arm and his mouth open, not screaming, just open, like a man who had been told a joke he could not work out. Then the white came in through the windows, and the windows were not windows anymore. I was in the bunker because I was sleeping off a fever. That is the only reason I am here to tell any of this. A bad fish and a good roof. When I came up out of the ground 3 days later, the company was a black smear, and the city beyond the company was a black smear, and the sky was the color of bruised meat. I walked south because south was downhill. There is no other reason. A man with no plan walks downhill until he finds water, and then he follows the water until he finds people. And if he does not find people, he keeps following the water because water is the only argument left. I want to be honest about those first weeks. I have read in old books about men who lost everything and went mad, and men who lost everything and turned holy, and men who lost everything and turned to other men for help. None of that happened to me. I went gray. That is the best word. I went gray on the inside and gray on the outside, and I walked, and I drank from streams that probably should not have been drunk from, and I slept under whatever was overhead, and I did not feel anything because there was nothing left in me that knew how. I had buried the captain, and I had buried my friend Pieter, and I had buried Pieter's small dog, which I had liked more than I had ever told him, and after that I had nothing left to bury. I walked through villages that were no longer villages. I walked through a school where the desks were still in rows. I walked past a church where the bells had melted and run down the inside of the tower in long pale lines, and I sat down for a while at that church because the lines were so quiet and so final that they looked almost like a decision. I followed it for 4 years, and I never found people. I found the forest instead. That is what we used to call it before, and it is what I still call it, although forest is not exactly right anymore. The trees that came up after the strikes are not the trees my grandmother planted. They are taller and quieter, and their bark has a faint shine to it, like wet stone. The leaves come in late and stay late, and they hum in a wind you cannot feel on your face. I have learned what they will and will not do. I have learned which berries will fill your belly and which will swell your tongue until it stops your throat. I have learned that the deer that walk through the new forest do not have the right number of legs, and that they will let you take one of them if you say thank you out loud. I do not know why this is. I have stopped asking. I built my house in the side of a ridge above a stream that runs clean. I built it the way my grandmother built her chicken coops, which is to say, I built it to outlast me. I planted 3 rows of potatoes and a long row of beans, and I kept a notebook in oilskin, because the act of writing things down is the act of pretending someone will read them. I kept the notebook for 4 years. I am not a sentimental man, but a man without sentiment is a man who has agreed to die, and I had not yet agreed. I should say, before I go further, what it was that came down behind the bombs. The bombs were ours. We did that to ourselves, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the bombs were only the opening. The bombs were the door being kicked in. What came through the door is what this story is about. We did not see them for a long time. By the time I knew they existed, the world had already been theirs for years. I learned about them the way a man learns about weather, by being caught in it. The first time I saw one, I was kneeling at the stream filling a jug. I heard a sound behind me that I cannot describe except to say it was the sound a wet rope makes when you drag it across stone. I went very still. I had been still in war, and I was stiller now. I turned my head only as far as my eye would go. It was standing on the other side of the stream, half in the shadow of a fern that should not have grown that large. It was the height of a tall man, and it was shaped roughly like a tall man, but everything about its shape was wrong in small ways that added up to something I could not look at for long. Its skin had the dull glitter of broken glass set into clay. Its head was narrow and forward-leaning, and where a man would have eyes it had a band of something darker than skin, smooth, with no seam. It had no mouth that I could see. Its hands had too many joints. It was holding something that hung from a strap, something the size of a small loaf, and the loaf was breathing. It did not see me. I learned later that they do not see the way we see. They listen for something else, something inside us, and that day I was holding mine quiet because I was a man at a stream and there was no one to be loud for. It walked on. The loaf went with it. The water ran. I knelt there long enough for my knees to forget they were knees, and when I stood I went home, and I did not light a fire for 6 days. I called them the Tessin because in the second week I found a piece of one. A scout, I think, that had fallen down a slope and broken on a rock. Its skin had a stamped marking on the inside of the wrist plate. The shape of the marking was like the character my grandmother used to draw to mean fan, the folding fan she kept in her parlor, and I needed a name for them, and I was not going to give them a good one. So Tessin they were, a folded thing that opens to cut. I learned them piece by piece, the way you learn a disease. They moved at night by preference, but they would move by day if a thing was worth moving for. They did not eat, not the way we eat. They carried the loaves, those breathing soft things, and they fed them. The loaves were what mattered. The Tessin themselves were the legs and arms of the loaves. The loaves were what was hungry. I worked this out from watching, and from one bad afternoon when I followed a pair of them at a careful distance and saw what they did at a clearing near the old highway. There was a man there. I had not seen another human being in 3.5 years, and I almost broke cover. He was older than me, thin, dressed in scraps, and he was on his knees in the center of the clearing crying for someone called Anik. He was not crying loudly. He was crying the way men cry when there is no audience and the grief has finally caught up. The two Tessin stood at the edge of the clearing with the loaves out and unwrapped, and the loaves were opened toward him like a man opening his mouth to a smell. They did not touch him. They did not need to. After a long time the man stopped crying and he sagged, and after a longer time he fell forward onto his hands, and after a longer time still he stopped moving. The loaves had brightened. That is the only word. They had a soft sheen to them now, like fruit ripening in fast time. The Tessin wrapped them carefully and walked back into the trees. I never saw them touch the body. They did not need the body. They had taken what they came for. I went home and I sat on the floor of my house and I shook for an hour. Then I wrote in my notebook. I wrote, "They eat what we feel. They eat the loud part. They follow the loud part home." It was the most important sentence I ever wrote, and I did not yet know it. I changed my habits after that. I stopped saying my grandmother's name out loud. I stopped looking at the photograph I had carried in my pack since the first week. I stopped letting myself remember the captain's open mouth. I did not stop feeling these things. A man cannot. But I stopped feeding them the air. I kept everything inside the box where I keep myself, and I closed the box, and I went on living the small gray life of a man who has agreed that nothing more will ever happen. Then something more happened. It was a morning in what I think was autumn, although the seasons have gone strange and you cannot trust the trees. I had set a snare in the lower run and the snare had taken something. I went down to look and the snare was empty and the dirt around it had been disturbed by a footprint that was not mine and not a deer's and not a Tesson's. It was a human footprint, a small one, bare. The toes had pressed in deep, like the foot had been running. I stood over that print for a long time. I knelt and put my own hand next to it. My palm was wider than the whole foot. Whoever had taken my snare was small, and whoever had taken my snare was alive. I tracked the print to the stream and lost it there, which told me they knew enough to break a trail in water. That was the second important thing I learned that day. The first was that I was not alone. The second was that whoever was not alone with me knew how to hide. I went home and I sat in my doorway with my old bow across my knees and I waited. I do not know what I was waiting for. Whoever had taken my rabbit was not going to walk up to my door and apologize. But I had become a man who waited, and I waited. She came on the third night. I had banked the fire and I was in the doorway because the house was hot, and I saw her shape against the line of the trees. She was small and thin, and she was holding the rabbit, or what was left of it, by its back legs. She held it out toward me from 20 paces away. She did not come closer. She did not speak. I did not raise the bow. I do not know why. There was something in the way she stood, very still and very ready, that told me a raised bow would be the end of the conversation, and I had been a long time without a conversation. I said, "You can keep the rabbit." She did not answer. I said, "Are you alone?" She did not answer. I said, "Can you understand me?" She nodded once. I said, "Can you speak?" She shook her head once. We looked at each other across 20 paces of cold grass, and I felt, for the first time in 4 years, the small, painful pulling sensation of being seen by another person. It was not pleasant. It was the feeling of a frozen limb coming back to life. I said, "There is soup," and I went inside. I did not look to see if she would follow. I sat at the small table and I poured soup into the second bowl, which I had carried with me from the bunker without ever once using, and I sat with my hands folded and I waited. After what must have been 20 minutes, I heard her come in. She stood in the doorway with the rabbit still in her hand, and she looked at the second bowl and she looked at me. I said, "Sit if you want." She sat. She ate. She ate the way an animal eats, watching me over the spoon, and when the bowl was empty she put it down and she put the rabbit on the table next to it as if it were payment. I said, "What is your name?" She put a finger to her throat and shook her head, and I understood. There was a scar there I had not seen in the firelight, a pale ridge low across the neck. Someone had taken her voice from her with a knife. Not recently. Years. I said, "I am Hendrik. I will call you something if you want me to. Tell me a letter." She thought a moment. Then she drew, with her finger on the table, the letter M. I said, "MM." She nodded. That is how she came into my house, and that is how I learned, slowly, over the weeks that followed, that I was not the last man on earth, and that the world I had taught myself to live in was much larger and much worse than I had let it become. She was perhaps 19. I am not good at ages, and the years had been hard on her. She had been moving alone for a long time, longer than I had been in the Ridge House, and she had been moving because she was being hunted. She drew it for me with twigs and pebbles on the floor by the fire, a small pile of pebbles for her, a larger pile of pebbles for the men who wanted her, a pebble apart from those for what those men served. She drew a Tesson with a stick in the ash. She did it well. She had seen them up close. I said, "How long?" She held up 4 fingers. Years, I assumed. Then she held up the 4 fingers again and laid them down and held up another hand. 9 years. Almost the whole time since the strikes. I said, "And the men?" She drew 4 figures with the stick. She tapped one and made a sign I did not know. She tapped the second and pointed at her own head and tapped it like a man knocking on a door, and I understood she meant a man who was simple. She tapped the third and made a slashing motion, and I understood he was the cruel one. She tapped the fourth and put both hands together and bowed her head, and at first I thought she meant a holy man, and then I understood she meant the one the others followed, the one who decided, the captain of them. I said, and they want you because. She did not draw the answer to that one. She looked at me a long time and then she stood and walked to the fire and put her hand into the ash. She held her hand in the ash. She did not flinch. She brought her hand out and it was clean, and the ash that had been around it was gone too, and there was a small patch of bare floor where the ash had been. I have seen many strange things in my life. I have seen a man walk on a leg that was no longer there. I have seen a woman pray a fever out of her child, but I had not seen a person take ash off a stone floor without bending. I sat very still while she walked back to her stool and sat down with her clean hand in her lap and her eyes on the fire. I said, "How?" She shook her head, "Not know, I do not know." I said, "And they want this from you." She nodded. I did not press further that night. I gave her my bed and I slept in the chair, and in the morning she was still there, which was when I understood that whatever life I had been keeping was over and a different one had started. In the days that followed, I learned her in the way a man learns a language he has not used in a long time. She woke before me. She walked with her shoulders up and her chin down, the way a woman walks who has spent years being the smallest thing in a room of bad men. She would not stand with her back to a door. She would not eat the first portion of anything until I had eaten mine. She watched my hands when I worked, not my face, which told me something about who had taught her to read men. She liked the beans. She liked the small carved spoon I had made in the second winter to stop my own hands from going stupid in the cold. She would pick the spoon up off the table sometimes and turn it over and put it down again, as if checking that a small carved thing still existed in the world. On the 4th day she went out before dawn and came back with 3 rabbits and a handful of the bitter green that grows in the lower run, the one I had not eaten because it looked too much like a plant my grandmother had said would close a throat. She put one of the leaves on her tongue and chewed it and swallowed it and looked at me, and I understood that she was telling me it was safe. We ate the bitter green that night with the rabbit, and it was the best food I had eaten in 4 years, and I do not think it was the food. On the 6th day she found my notebook. She had been polite about my things until then. She picked up the oilskin and weighed it in her hand and looked at me, asking. I nodded. She opened it. She could read. She read every page slowly, her finger under the words the way a child reads, although she was not a child and had not been one in a long time. She read about the Tessin and the loaves and the clearing on the highway. She read the sentence I had written about how they ate what we felt. When she got to that sentence, she stopped. She looked at me for a long time. She put her hand on the page over the words and held it there, and I understood that she had known the sentence already, had known it for 9 years, had simply not had a man to say it back to her. She closed the notebook. She handed it back. We did not speak about it. We did not need to. I should say something else about those 11 days, because it is the part of the story I find hardest to tell. I had been alone for 4 years, and I had not realized how lonely I was until I was not. I had become a man shaped like a man who lived alone. When M came into the house, the shape did not fit anymore, and the not fitting hurt. I would wake in the small hours and hear her breathing in the other room, and the breathing would catch me by the throat. I would put my hand on the wall between us, not to wake her, just to know the wall was there, and the wall was warmer than I had ever noticed before because she was on the other side of it. I am 61 years old. I had not put my hand on a wall to feel another person on the other side since I was a boy in my grandmother's house, and even then I had only done it once, the night my grandmother had been sick and I had been afraid she would die in the dark. She had not died that night. She had died many years later in a hospital, and I had not been there. The wall in my ridge house was not warmer because M was warmer than other people. The wall was warmer because I had let it be. The cost came in 11 days. She had been with me 11 days when I saw the first sign. A line of broken ferns on the high path, broken in a way that no animal breaks ferns. I went home by a different way and I did not tell her. I did not want to feed the fear with words. I cleaned the bow. I sharpened the long knife. I packed 2 bundles, mine and hers, and I put them by the door. She watched me do this and she did not ask. She knew. They came at dusk on the 12th day. I heard the dogs first. They had dogs, the men who hunted her, although what they called dogs were not what my grandmother would have called dogs. The strikes had taken the dogs, and what came back to fill the role were narrower and quieter, and they ran with their heads down. I heard 3 of them on the lower path, and I knew we had perhaps 10 minutes. I said to M, "We go now, out the back, up the ridge into the trees." She stood and took her bundle. She did not look at the house. She did not look at the small life I had built. She had been the one who had to leave things behind for 9 years, and she knew not to look. I was the one who looked. I looked once at the doorway my grandmother would have approved of, and at the row of beans, and at the small fire I had banked for the night, and then I turned and I followed him out the back. We went up the ridge in the last of the light, and we made it into the dark forest before the dogs came over the lip behind the house. I heard the men shouting then. They had voices. I had not heard human voices in years. They were ugly voices, the voices of men who had decided that the world owed them what was in front of them, and they had decided this for a long time. We moved through the trees that night and most of the next day. M knew where to go. She had been moving in these woods longer than I had. She took us through a deer run and over a stream twice and into a stand of the shining bark trees where the dogs lost the scent. We stopped in a hollow where the rock was warm from the day, and she lay down and slept, and I sat with the bow across my knees and I watched. I want to tell you about the men. I learned them properly later, but I will say them now, because they were the closer enemy in the days that followed, and the closer enemy is the one a man learns first. There were 4 of them. The captain was a tall, narrow man with a beard cut short and eyes set so deep you could not find them in shadow. His name was Samuel. He had been a sergeant before the strikes. He had kept his rank in his head, and he ran his men like a unit. He was not stupid, and he was not loud, and he was the most dangerous of the 4, because the other 3 were what he made them. The second man was Dan. Dan was thick, and he liked the sound of his own voice. He had been a butcher before, or maybe a foreman in a slaughterhouse, and he had brought the slaughterhouse with him. He was the one who handled the dogs. He talked to them more than he talked to the others. He was a man who needed a thing under him to be a man at all. The third was Coos. Coos was Dan's shadow. He was younger and softer, and he did what he was told, and he did not look at the things he was told to do. I think Coos had been a boy when the strikes came. I think he had grown up under Samuel and would not have known any other shape to grow into. I felt for Coos in the way you feel for a dog that has been kicked into the shape of a weapon. But a kicked dog still bites. The fourth was Mark. Mark was the simple one. He had been broken in his head, maybe by the strikes and maybe by what came after, and he followed the others because they fed him. He carried the bulk of the gear. He was big enough to carry it. He did not know what he was doing. The cruelty of him was that the others let him not know. These 4 had been hunting him for 9 years. They had taken her voice when she was a child because she screamed when they took her father, and Samuel was a man who believed that a tool was best when it could not call for help. They had used her power for those 9 years to extract things from places men could not reach. They had used it on Tessin too. She had pulled the silicate out of a Tessin scout once, the way she pulled the ash from my floor, and the scout had collapsed like a dropped sack. That was the secret they kept her for. She was the only weapon any human being had ever had against the Tessin, and she had broken away from them 3 months before she found my snare. I learned all of this slowly, in pebbles and gestures and ash drawings, over the long days that followed. But that is who they were, and that is who came for us, and I will tell you now what happened. We ran for 6 days. We ran north, through the new forest, in a long looping pattern that M chose because she had run it before. The dogs were good, but they were not great, and the new forest confused them in ways I did not understand, but M did. There was something in the bark of the shining trees, she showed me, that made the dogs lose the scent if you brushed against the bark while moving. So we moved in the bark. We came out of those trees coated in a fine gray shimmer like ash, and the dogs sat down behind us and would not come further. It was hard on me. I will not pretend otherwise. I had not run in 4 years, and I had not run from men in many more. My right knee, which had taken a piece of shrapnel a year before the strikes, decided on the second day that it would no longer agree to run, and after that I walked through the running, and M slowed down to my pace without ever once turning to look at me. She knew not to look. To look would have been to ask the knee what it thought, and the knee would have answered. So she did not look. She kept her pace at mine, and we moved at the speed of a 61-year-old man with a bad knee, and somehow that was enough. We slept in turns. We did not light fires. We ate what we had brought, and on the third night what we had brought ran out, and M went up a tree in the dark and came back with the eggs of a bird I had never seen before, 3 eggs the size of plums, and we ate them raw, and they tasted of pine and something else, something older, and the third egg I gave to her because she had climbed and I had not. She ate it, and she put her hand on my wrist again, the small squeeze, and we went on. On the 5th day the dogs caught us briefly. We had crossed open ground because we had to, a wide flat plain that had been a wheat field once and was now a kind of pale grass that whispered when you walked through it, and the dogs picked up the scent at the far edge and came at us with their heads low. There were 3 of them. I shot 2 with the bow at 30 paces. The third one M did. She did not need her hand on the ground for the dog. She put her hand on the dog itself, the way you put your hand on a sick child's forehead, and the dog stopped. It did not fall. It did not yelp. It simply stopped like a clock running down and lay down in the grass and went asleep and did not wake up. I have thought about that dog many times since. I think she could have done that to a man if she had wanted to. I think she did not want to. I think she had decided, somewhere in the 9 years, what she would and would not use her hand for, and a dog at the end of a long chase was on the side of the line she would do it for, and a man at the start of a long argument was not. That was M. She had a line. The line was hers, and it was old, and it was a real line. On the 6th night they caught us anyway, not the dogs, the men. Samuel had been ahead of us the whole time. He had known the forest too, and he had not chased. He had walked. We came down off a ridge into a wide hollow, and the 4 of them were waiting on the far side. They had the bows up before I had mine off my shoulder. Samuel said, "M, come here." M did not move. She stood beside me with her hand at her side, and I could feel the small heat of her wanting to put that hand on the ground. Samuel said, "We have missed you." Dan laughed. It was the wrong laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had practiced laughing in front of other men until they were afraid of him for it. Samuel said to me, "Old man, step aside. She is not yours. She has never been yours. She was ours 9 years before you found her, and she will be ours 9 years after you are bones. Step aside." I said no. I said it quietly. I do not think any of them heard the no itself. They heard the tone. Samuel's eyes did something then. He recognized me. Not me by name, me by kind. He had been a sergeant. He knew what a man sounds like when he has decided. Samuel said, "You will die for nothing." I said, "I will die for her." It was the most direct sentence I had spoken in 4 years, and it was true. I have thought about that sentence many times since. I have looked at it from the other side, and I have not found a side that makes it less true. I had been a man with nothing left. She had come to my door with a rabbit. That is the whole of it. Samuel raised his bow. Dan raised his. Coos raised his slowly, as if his arms were heavier than they should have been. Mark did not raise his because Mark did not have a bow, only a long club with nails in it that he held across his chest. What happened next I will tell as it happened. M moved before the arrows came. She did not move fast. She moved the way she had moved at my fire, the small, smooth movement of a person who knows exactly the volume of the thing she is doing. She knelt. She put both hands flat on the ground. She looked up at Samuel, and she opened her mouth. And what came out of her mouth was not a scream, but it was a sound, a thin gray sound that I had not heard from her before. And it occurred to me only later that it must have been everything she had not been able to say for 9 years pressed into one breath. The ground in front of her went away. That is the only way I can say it. A line of ground perhaps 2 paces wide, running from her hands toward the 4 men, simply stopped being ground. The dirt and the stones and the small roots all came up into the air in a fine gray mist and hung there for a half-second and then fell. But where they fell there was a trench, deep as a man, with the long roots of the shining trees laid bare in its walls. Dan's arrow went wild. Coos did not shoot. Samuel shot, and his arrow took him high in the shoulder, but M was already standing, and the trench was between us and them, and M's hand was still down, and she was bringing it up slow. I shot Dan in the throat. I did not enjoy it. I am telling you what happened. I had not shot a man in 5 years, and my hands were not steady, but the bow was a good bow, and Dan was a large target, and I had been a soldier, and you do not forget. He went down with his eyes very surprised. Coos sat down on the ground and put his hands over his head. Mark stood and looked at Dan, and his mouth opened, and he made a low sound and did not move. Samuel reloaded. He was fast. He had been fast all his life. He had his second arrow on the string and the string at his cheek when M finished bringing her hand up. The silicate came out of him through his skin. It was the strangest and most terrible thing I have ever seen, and I have seen many. It was not all at once. It was a slow rise. The plates under his clothing came up and out and gathered in the air in front of him in a small drifting cloud, and Samuel's eyes went wide because he understood at last what she had done to the Tessin scout 9 years ago, and what she could do to a man who had pulled too long on the wrong rope. His arrow went into the ground at his foot. His knees folded. He fell forward, and he was already empty. There is a thing the Tessin had put into the men. I did not know it then. I learned it later. They had put silicate into the men who served them, into the meat of the men, so that the men would carry the trace and the loaves could find them in the dark. Samuel had thought of it as a contract. He had thought he was using them. He had not understood that a contract that goes both ways is also a leash. M had pulled the leash out of him. The M I knew could not have done that to a man who did not have the silicate in him. I want you to understand that. She did not kill a man. She killed a thing the Tessin had put in a man, and the man went with it because the man had agreed. Coos stayed on the ground with his hands over his head, and he was crying. He was not pretending. He was 19 years old, and he had been crying since he was 10, and now he could finally show it. Mark stood beside Dan's body, and he made his low sound, and he did not move. M sat down very suddenly on the dirt because Samuel's arrow was still in her shoulder, and she had used what she had. I crossed the trench. I went to M first. I put my hand on her good shoulder, and I said her name, and she looked at me, and she nodded, which meant alive. The arrow had gone through the meat and out the back. It would not kill her if I worked clean. I broke the shaft, and I left the head for later because we did not have later yet. I stood up. I looked at Coos and at Mark, and I lifted my bow halfway and let it down again. I am not a man who shoots people who are sitting down. My grandmother would not have known me if I had been. I said to Coos, "How many?" He said, "What?" I said, "How many of you, in the world apart from these?" He said, "I do not know, a few, not many. We came out of the camp at the dam. There were maybe 20 there. Some have died, some have walked off. I do not know." I said, "And you served the Tessin?" He did not look up. He said, "We did not call them that. We called them the others." Samuel said, "We worked for the others. We brought them things and they let us live." I said, "You brought them what they ate." He did not answer that. I said, "You brought them human grief." He put his face in his hands. I had to choose then, and I want to be honest about the choice. There was a moment, perhaps 2 heartbeats long, where I considered killing them both. Coos was a man who had helped do these things. Mark was a thing that had carried what they did. I had M beside me bleeding from a wound that Kuz had stood beside while it was made. I lifted the bow halfway again. I felt the small, dumb, stubborn thing in my chest pull against the action. I let the bow down. I said, Mark, come here. Mark looked up. He had a wide face and slow eyes, and he did not understand the world, but he understood a voice giving him an instruction, and he came. He crossed the trench in 2 strides because he was that big. I said, sit by your friend. He sat by Dan. He put his hand on Dan's shoulder and he made the low sound again, and I understood that Dan had been kind to Mark, in whatever small way a man like Dan could be kind, and that Mark would mourn Dan in the only way he knew how. I let him. I said to Kuz, get up, take your friend, go west. There is a river 2 days west, and beyond the river there is nothing for 100 miles. Walk, do not stop, do not look for us, do not come back. If I see you again, I will not lift this bow halfway. He stood up, he looked at me a long time. He said, you will not last, the others know about her. They will send the cleaners now. I said, walk. He took Mark by the arm and he walked. I watched them until they were over the lip of the hollow and gone. Mark made his low sound the whole way, and Kuz did not turn around. I went back to him. I cut the arrowhead out. I packed the wound with a paste my grandmother would have known by name. M did not make a sound. She had no sound to make. She watched my hands, and when I was done she put her good hand on my wrist and she squeezed once, and that was the whole of her thanks. We did not stay in the hollow. We moved a mile north into a stand of trees where the bark shimmered, and we lay down and slept with the bow across my knees. And when I woke, the dawn was gray and M was awake before me, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. She drew with her finger in the dirt. She drew the 4 men, then crossed out 2 of them. Then she drew a circle around me and her. Then she drew, very carefully, a great many small shapes coming in from all sides of the circle. I said, cleaners. She nodded. I said, how many? She held up both hands. She closed them and held them up again. She closed them and held them up a 3rd time. 30, maybe more. I said, how long? She drew a sun and a moon and a sun. I said, 2 days. She nodded. I sat there a long time in the gray light, and I thought. I thought about the bunker and the captain's mouth. I thought about my grandmother and her hands in the dirt. I thought about the clearing on the old highway and the man crying for Anik and the loaves brightening. I thought about Samuel falling forward empty. I thought about M with her hand in the ash. Then I thought a small clear thought that I have remembered ever since. I thought they eat what we feel. They follow the loud part home. M can take what they put in a man back out again. We have 2 days. We have a forest. We have the things my grandmother knew about leaves. I stood up. M watched me stand. I said, we are not going to run. She tilted her head. I said, we are going to call them. Her eyes went still. I said, all of them. Every cleaner. Every loaf. Every walking glass-skinned thing they have within a day's march. We are going to ring the bell, and we are going to put a table out for them, and we are going to put on that table what they think they want. And then you and I and the things my grandmother taught me are going to give them an evening they will tell stories about on whatever rock they come from. She looked at me for a long time. Then she smiled. It was the first time I saw her smile, and it was a small, terrible smile. And it was the smile of the girl who had been carried in a cage for 9 years and had finally been asked the right question. She drew in the dirt. She drew a fan. She underlined it. The folded thing that opens to cut. I will not tell you everything we did over the next 2 days. Some of it was tools. Some of it was leaves. Some of it was my grandmother's notebook, which I had carried in oilskin for 4 years, and which had in it the names of 7 plants that, when burned together, produce a smoke that the Tessin had reason to fear, and that I had only ever read about as a footnote. I had never burned the 7 plants together. I had thought it was a footnote. I had thought a great many things were footnotes. That is what a man does when he is alone. He demotes the things that matter to the size he can carry. I had demoted my grandmother's whole second book to a footnote because the second book was about things you only used when other men were close enough to use them against. I had not had other men close enough for 4 years. I had filed the second book away. I unfiled it now. I sat by the fire with M and I read it out to her in a low voice, and she did not say anything because she could not, but she listened the way a soldier listens to an order from a captain he trusts, and I had not been trusted by anyone in a long time, and I felt the weight of it. The 7 plants were on page 19. The instructions for the smoke were on page 20. Page 21 was blank, because my grandmother had not lived long enough to finish what was on her mind, and I have always thought that the blank page was the most honest page in the book. M went out for the plants. She was the better tracker, and she knew the new forest better, and she had no voice to give away. I stayed at the ridge house and I built. I cut the wooden bowl for the blood. I cleaned the long knife. I took the bow apart and restrung it with the new string I had been keeping for an occasion I had not believed in. I emptied my pack of everything that was not necessary, and I put back into it only what would matter in the bowl. I wrote 1 line in the notebook in the clearest hand I could manage, in case the notebook was the only thing that came out of the next 2 days. I wrote, "They eat what we feel. We can choose what we feed them." M came back at dusk on the first day with the 7 plants in a bundle wrapped in her own shirt, and she had a fresh cut along her forearm from something she had not told me about, and she let me clean the cut and she let me wrap it, and we did not speak. I will tell you what mattered. I will tell you that we picked a clearing 2 miles east of the ridge house, in the shape of a bowl, with a single way in. I will tell you that we laid the 7 plants in a wide ring inside the bowl, and covered them in damp leaves so they would smoke and not burn. I will tell you that I cut my own arm and let the blood run into a wooden bowl in the center of the ring, because the Tessin did not eat blood, but they followed the noise of grief, and there was no louder grief in the world than a man bleeding out alone in a clearing and remembering everyone he had lost. I will tell you that I knelt by that bowl and I let myself feel it. I let myself feel the captain with his helmet under his arm. I let myself feel my grandmother's hands on mine teaching me which leaf was for which wound. I let myself feel the 4 years in the ridge house. I let myself feel M coming to the door with a rabbit. I felt all of it. I did not put it in a box. I did not lock it down. I opened the box and I dumped it on the floor of the bowl and I let it ring. They came the way a tide comes. I counted 36 before I stopped counting. They came in from the trees on all sides of the bowl and they stood at the rim of it, and the loaves at their belts were already brightening. And I knelt at the center and I bled into the bowl and I felt and felt and felt. And M stood behind me on the lip of the bowl with her hands at her sides and her eyes on Samuel's old captain, the one with the long head and the band where eyes would be, who had come to the rim to taste what was being offered. When the bowl of them was full, I said, "Now." M put her hands on the ground. The silicate came up from all of them, from every Tessin at the rim of the bowl, and from every loaf at every belt. The silicate came up out of the skin and out of the wraps, and it gathered in a great drifting gray cloud above the bowl. And the Tessin folded down where they stood like clothes being dropped, and the loaves split open and steamed away into the air. And the great gray cloud hung there a long moment as if uncertain, and then it fell. And where it fell into the damp leaves, and the damp leaves caught. And the 7 plants under the damp leaves caught, and the smoke that came up out of the ring was a smoke that had not been seen on the earth in a long time. The smoke of a thing my grandmother had only ever told me about because her grandmother had only ever told her. And the smoke went into the silicate, and the silicate did not come back together. There was a sound. I do not know how to describe the sound except to say that it was the sound of a great many things deciding at once to stop being. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the sound the world makes when something that should not have been here goes back to wherever it came from. It went on for perhaps a minute and then it stopped, and the bowl was full of gray ash and folded skins, and M was on her knees and her hand was still on the ground. I crawled to her. I was bleeding and I was light in the head and I was crying without knowing it. I put my arm around her good shoulder and she put her head against me, and we knelt in the center of the bowl in the smoke of 7 plants, and we did not speak because she could not and I could not. There were more Tessin in the world. I knew that. There would be cleaners we had not called and loaves we had not split, and somewhere on whatever dying rock they had come from there would be the larger thing that had sent them. I knew this and I know it now. I am not telling you that I saved the world. I am telling you what we did in one bowl in one forest on one evening, and I am telling you that for a long time after that evening, the Tessin did not come into the new forest, and that the man who tells you this is the man who knelt in the bowl. We walked back to the Ridge House in the morning. M was thin and quiet. I was older than I had been the week before by 10 years. The house was as I had left it. The beans were as I had left them. The notebook in its oilskin was on the small table next to the empty bowl that had been M's first bowl of soup. I put the kettle on, I sat down. M sat across from me. We did not speak. We had not spoken much before and we did not start now. She drew a small thing with her finger in the dust on the table, a fan folded. I drew a small thing next to it, a potato. She smiled the small smile again, and it was not terrible anymore. It was the smile of a person who was going to sleep that night in a bed, and the night after that, and the night after that, and who had not been able to count on such a thing in 9 years. I am still in the Ridge House. M is here. We are not lovers. I do not want anyone to think that. She is the daughter I did not have, and I am the father she was taken from, and the shape of what we are is older than either of those words. We plant the beans. We mend the snares. We watch the trees. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit in the doorway with the bow across my knees, and I look at the line where the new forest begins. I think about the captain with his open mouth. I think about my grandmother's hands. I think about Samuel falling forward empty and Coos walking west with Mark making his low sound. I think about the 36 in the bowl and the gray cloud that did not come back together. I think about my grandmother saying that everything green is a kind of patience. I think she was right. I think the Tessin did not understand patience. They understood hunger and they understood the loud parts of us, and they thought that was all of us, and that was the mistake they made. They thought that a creature that grieves can be eaten through its grief. They did not know that a creature that grieves can also choose, in the middle of the grieving, to bleed into a wooden bowl and ring the bell and put a table out. They did not know that the loud part is not the dangerous part. The dangerous part is the part that goes quiet and decides. I do not know if any of this matters in the larger story of the world. I do not know if there are men in other forests doing other things. I hope there are. I hope they have their own grandmothers and their own notebooks and their own strangers at the door with rabbits. But here is what I know. The sky is still bruised in the evenings, and the new forest still hums in a wind I cannot feel on my face. The deer still walk past with the wrong number of legs, and let me take one if I say thank you out loud. The beans came up well this year. M sleeps in the room that was empty for 4 years. The notebook in oilskin has new pages now, and on those pages I have written the names of the 7 plants in a clearer hand, so that whoever comes after me, if anyone does, will know what to burn and what to grow. And in the corner of the last page in a small hand, M has drawn a fan. Folded. Ready to open.